StoryGrid tools. As story nerds through and through, we have our own version of tech nerds' cool gadgets and gizmos. Our StoryGrid tools help us analyze and improve our writing. There is an array to choose from, and some you'll find more useful for early drafts, while others help most in the editing process. Here's a quick inventory of the toolbox. The Fool's Cap and Editor's 6 Core Questions. The Fool's Cap and the Editor's 6 Core Questions are among the first StoryGrid tools any writer or editor makes use of. A fool's cap is an old-fashioned term for a yellow legal pad of paper. According to author Stephen Pressfield, a single fool's cap page is the perfect amount of space for sketching out the essential outline of any story. This is how we suggest writers begin, even if you prefer to write by the seat of your pants with no strict outline. To make building that essential outline easier, you can ask yourself 6 questions and record the answers on the page. These happen to be the first questions a StoryGrid editor will consider when evaluating your story. So the writer's fool's cap and the editor's 6 core questions are identical. The questions, with brief explanations, are 1. What's the global genre? StoryGrid puts all stories into content genres, similar to but not precisely the same as the sales categories we see on Amazon or in brick-and-mortar stores. We separate stories into 9 external genres and 3 internal genres, which we discuss a bit more in the next section. You'll find links to detailed discussions of the genres with cheat sheets for each in the article Genres of Writing. What are they? Why do they matter on the StoryGrid website? 2. What are the conventions and obligatory events for your genre? Conventions are the elements of a particular genre that must appear in a story to set up reader expectations. A mystery must have an investigator, whether professional or amateur, to solve a crime, for example. Obligatory events are required to pay off reader expectations in a particular genre. A murder mystery must include a scene in which someone discovers the dead body. Although at first glance the conventions and obligatory events appear to be a simple list of items to include in stories of a particular genre, it's not really a list, but a tool that enhances your ability to show readers the global pattern of change. You'll learn much of what you need to know about conventions and obligatory events in the article Genres Have Conventions and Obligatory Scenes on StoryGrid.com, and in StoryGrid editor Kim Kessler's presentation Conventions and Obligatory Scenes, which you can listen to or read at StoryGrid.com. 3. What are the point of view, POV, and narrative device? The POV and narrative device combine to establish the vantage point you use to tell the reader your story and dictate the tenor of each scene. We're all familiar with the first person, second person, and third person POVs. Like many 19th century authors, Jane Austen uses primarily the third person omniscient point of view. Thomas Harris employs the powerful combination of first and third person in The Silence of the Lambs. This allows Harris into the thoughts of the protagonist and several other characters, a valuable tool in a thriller. We also need to consider the narrative device that is the bridge between the minds of the author and the reader. For example, does that connection take the form of a diary, a fictional autobiography, or stream of consciousness? The POV and narrative device must work together because they determine how you present that story to your readers. If they are not in sync, you'll undermine your story. You'll find helpful articles about POV on the StoryGrid website, including Consider the Source, Elements of Point of View and Narrative Device, and Choosing Your Point of View, also at StoryGrid.com. 4. What are the objects of desire? If you know your genre, you've probably already figured out your protagonist's objects of desire. Whether those are external wants or internal needs, objects of desire drive the actions of other characters in your story too, especially the external antagonist. Identifying what characters want helps you understand what actions they will take to achieve their desires. Wants are your characters' conscious desires and goals, the things they believe they're on a journey to get. These wants are typically connected directly to the external content genre of your story. For example, in Pride and Prejudice, a courtship love story, Elizabeth Bennet wants to marry a true gentleman and rejects those who fall short. Needs are your character's subconscious desires, what they truly require in order to complete their journey. Needs are typically dictated by the internal content genre of your story. Elizabeth Bennet's journey toward marriage, the classic resolution of a courtship love story, is really about her need for a mature, sophisticated understanding of love. The internal content genre of Pride and Prejudice is worldview maturation. A helpful place to find further information about objects of desire is the article Story Fuel at StoryGrid.com. Also take a look at StoryGrid editor Ann Hawley's talk, an article on the topic here. storygrid.com/editor roundtable Objects of Desire, and the article by former StoryGrid editor Larry Pass, Objects of Desire, Objects of Conflict, at storygrid.com. 5. What's the controlling idea or theme? The takeaway message that you want your reader to discover is your story's controlling idea or theme. Let's be clear. Few writers really know what this is at the start, so be patient. When you finally understand the theme that animates the characters and their choices, the story often comes to life in new ways. Ideally, the controlling idea will be boiled down to very few words, and no more than a sentence. It should describe the global value change and should be as specific as possible about what causes that change. It often seems a bit too simple, but that's the point. The controlling idea of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is, life's meaning reveals itself as we seize our individual agency and ceaselessly pursue a return to our vision of home. The controlling idea of Pride and Prejudice is, love triumphs when we dispel base attitudes and embrace the vibrant mix of humanity among all social classes. And for The Silence of the Lambs, it's life prevails when the hero identifies with the vulnerability of the victims as deeply as she understands the core pathology of the villain. You'll find discussions of the controlling idea in The Big Takeaway at storygrid.com and in StoryGrid editor Savannah Gilbo's article, Theme of a Story, 3 Ways to Uncover Yours, at storygrid.com/theme. 6. What is the beginning hook, middle build, and ending payoff? The last item you need on your handy foolscap page is a concise explanation of the 3 acts of your story, the beginning hook, the middle build, which can be broken into 2 parts, and ending payoff. For the beginning hook, you'll sum up the challenge or problem the protagonist faces. For the middle build, you'll sum up how the stakes are raised and how the tension builds for your protagonist on their journey. For the ending payoff, you'll sum up the climax of the global story or how the protagonist ultimately faces the challenge or solves the problem. In the editor's 6 core questions, we tend to sum things up in just a sentence. But when we create a foolscap, we like to include the 5 commandments in each section. As an example, let's look at the simplest 1-sentence summaries of hook, build, and payoff for The Silence of the Lambs. Beginning hook. Clarice Starling gets a job to interview Hannibal Lecter. Middle build. Hannibal Lecter escapes. Ending payoff. Clarice Starling catches and kills Buffalo Bill. Finally, for a hefty dose of inspiration, you'll find the foolscaps for The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, Pride and Prejudice, and The Silence of the Lambs at storygrid.com. The 12 content genres. As you're working on your foolscap, before you do anything else, you'll need to consider what kind of story you want to tell. The type or genre will depend on your protagonist's wants and needs. StoryGrid divides stories into 12 distinct content genres. 9 are external and based on your protagonist's wants. Those external genres are action, war, horror, crime, thriller, western, love, performance, and society. The 3 internal content genres, status, morality, and worldview, are defined by your protagonist's deeper internal needs. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz belongs in the action story genre, with an internal worldview maturation genre. The Silence of the Lambs is a thriller, with an internal genre of worldview disillusionment. And of course, Pride and Prejudice is a love story, with an internal genre of worldview maturation. We have plenty of articles on the StoryGrid website that can help you identify your genres, both internal and external, if you're having trouble. A good place to start is Genres of Writing. What are they? Why do they matter? At storygrid.com. A helpful tool that we use to translate your protagonist's needs into the proper genre is the StoryGrid Gas Gauge of Need, downloadable at the StoryGrid website. The spreadsheet. One of the defining tools of the StoryGrid approach to editing is our StoryGrid spreadsheet. We put details of our scenes into a spreadsheet to keep track of all the information when we analyze books, screenplays, and even long-form articles. For story nerds, there's nothing more exciting than compiling the data and discovering how a story is constructed from the inside out, top to bottom. It's like an MRI scan for your book. We won't go over each column and data point here, but some of the vital information for each and every scene includes word count, story event, value shift, turning point progressive complication or fear, point of view, period of time, duration, location, onstage and offstage characters mentioned. To understand the value of the spreadsheet, it helps to review one for a masterwork. You'll find a full StoryGrid spreadsheet for The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, for Pride and Prejudice, and for The Silence of the Lambs at storygrid.com. If we look at the spreadsheet of The Silence of the Lambs, we discover a wealth of information we wouldn't notice with any other tool. We see the variation in the length and duration of scenes that keeps the pace exciting and unpredictable. We see which characters appear most often, with whom, and where. We also see the turning point or fear and value shift for each scene. By looking at the details of the first 4 scenes of The Silence of the Lambs, we see how rapidly protagonist Clarice Starling's fortunes rise and fall, which helps to draw readers in and elicits their sympathy for her immediately. The value shifts in these scenes move her 1. From ignored as a novice agent in training to chosen for a special assignment. 2. From chosen for her merits to being used as bait by her bosses. 3. From an unwanted to a welcome guest of Hannibal Lecter. And 4. From encouraged by the opportunity she's had to discouraged when rebuffed by her boss. Looking at all other aspects of the spreadsheet, we see that Thomas Harris has squeezed a lot of action into just 2 days' time. And we note that he's also introduced 7 on-stage characters and an army of off-stage characters. It's easy to see how powerful this tool can be, and why we call it an MRI for your story, isn't it? The spreadsheet will reveal the skeleton and the muscles holding your scenes together, as well as any broken bones or wounds that need fixing. Scene analysis and story events. After counting the number of words in a scene, the first item we usually need to put into the StoryGrid spreadsheet is a summary of the scene, called a story event. As we mentioned in Principle 4 above, a story event is simply a short description of the active change in a scene. We use our scene analysis tools in the form of our 4 questions, also discussed previously, to find that key story event. Here's a quick example of how we discover the story event in another scene from Pride and Prejudice, in which Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy decide to marry. 1. What are the characters literally doing? That is, what are their micro on-the-ground actions? Darcy and Elizabeth go for a walk. 2. What is the essential tactic of the characters? That is, what macro behaviors are they employing that are linked to a universal human value? The 2 lovers confess their love and true feelings for one another. 3. What universal human values have changed for one or more characters in the scene? Which one of those value changes is most important and should be included in the StoryGrid spreadsheet? Elizabeth has gone from depressed because she believes her love is unrequited and can never be fulfilled, to overjoyed because Darcy returns her affection. 4. What story event sums up the scene's on-the-ground actions, essential tactics, and value change? We will enter that event in the StoryGrid spreadsheet. When Darcy and Bingley come to Longbourn, Elizabeth declares her feelings for Darcy and he returns those feelings, leading to a joyful reunion. The Infographic. There's another StoryGrid tool to mention, one that allows us to link insights on the macro and micro level, bringing together all the information we have in one visual snapshot. It's the StoryGrid Infographic. The infographic charts the progression of time in each scene along the x-axis, and the global values at stake in both the internal and external genres on the y-axis. You'll find the infographic for The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, for Pride and Prejudice, and for The Silence of the Lambs at storygrid.com under our Resources tab. The 4 Core Framework. One of the most helpful additions to our story toolbox recently is the 4 Core Framework, laid out in detail in a book by the same name. The framework is based on the expectations readers have for each content genre. If a writer can satisfy those expectations, readers will be delighted and want more, and tell their friends about it. StoryGrid can help you answer questions about reader expectations by bringing the core of your story into focus. The core makes a story irresistible, memorable, and worth sharing by providing readers with a cathartic emotional moment. Each of the elements that make up the 4 Core Framework supports the others, and they all work together to determine whether readers walk away satisfied. Those elements, with examples from Pride and Prejudice, are the core need, survival or esteem, for example. Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy share the core need for connection. That need awakens when they meet and requires that both become vulnerable and better versions of themselves before they can attain that need. The core life values, a range from life to death or impotence to power, for example. The life value at stake in Pride and Prejudice range from hate to love, with many gradations on that spectrum. The core emotion, excitement or admiration, for example. What we as readers want when we chose a love story is romance. If Elizabeth and Darcy can find authentic connection, perhaps we can too. And their story shows us that love matters because it makes us better people. The core event, a battle scene or a showdown between the protagonist and antagonist, for example. The core event is the proof of love scene, in which Darcy sacrifices to help Elizabeth and her family. Through this event, the connection between the two lovers becomes exponentially stronger. Stories' boundaries. We've examined stories from many angles using lots of tools and examples so far. But there's one final story grid tool we are continually developing. It brings us full circle, back to looking at the global unit of story. We believe that no matter the setting, theme, or characters, every story happens within boundaries that correspond to two kinds of change. We say these limits exist on the ground and in the clouds, and they are represented by two of our global content genres, the primal action story and the transcendent worldview story. In other words, action and worldview represent the external and internal boundaries of story respectively, and all of the other genres live in a space between them. Externally, every protagonist must act to create change in their environment, or on the ground. This is the action component of every story. Dorothy Gale acts to defeat the witch and get home. Elizabeth Bennet acts to find a proper husband. Clarice Starling acts to catch a killer. Characters enact internally formed tactics to further their global strategies to achieve long-term goals. That's how they pursue what they want. They actualize motor movements to move from point A, an unfulfilled goal, to point Z, a fulfilled goal, and either succeed or fail in those pursuits. Internally, when the protagonist tries to solve the problem presented by the inciting incident of their story, they rely on their existing knowledge base. But when unexpected events arise, their bedrock of knowledge breaks down and is found wanting. The protagonist must accept failure or transform the way they see the problem, transcending their current understanding by rising to a vantage point in the clouds, where they can break their own cognitive frame. This is the transcendent worldview component of every story. The character must transcend their state of being and level up to a higher state to solve the dilemma. Alternatively, they fail to do so and cling to their state as is or cognitively spiral downwards. Breaking the cognitive frame isn't as simple as thinking outside the box or seeing a problem from a new angle. Instead, the protagonist recognizes their current frame or way of understanding the world isn't up to the task of solving their problem. Something entirely new is called for, so Dorothy changes how she sees her own agency. Elizabeth redefines a good marriage, and Clarice loses faith in the institution of justice so she can embody justice.